Today we're going to be talking all about the dotnet Aspire dashboard, which hopefully you've seen make cameo appearances all throughout this stream, but we're really going to focus on it for the next 30 minutes here. So let's start with some slides real quick, just so we're all on the same page about what's going on. Hopefully people can see what I've got. All right, so we've got a couple things on the agenda today and a lot of ground to cover. But if you're new to this stream or you're new to Aspire, no worries. I'm going to get you caught up with a brief overview about the dashboard. And for this particular session, we're really going to focus a lot on telemetry. So specifically how telemetry or open telemetry works in Aspire and how ultimately it works with the dashboard to give you all of that wonderful diagnostics data that you know and love when working with an Aspire app. That said, the beauty about Aspire is that a lot of that telemetry is set up for you. So you don't even have to touch it if you don't want to. But if you do and you want to add your own custom metrics, traces, or logs, you can. And so I'll walk you through an example about how you can do that. And also, good news, if you don't even have an Aspire app, first of all, you totally should. Hopefully the stream is convincing you to give Aspire a try if you haven't already. No worries there. But if you don't have an Aspire app, that's okay because you can take advantage of the standalone dashboard experience. And finally, we will also talk a little bit about environmental variables that you can add to that standalone dashboard experience for your customization needs. And I was originally going to talk about deployment, but I think Maddie and Brady covered that very well in the session that was right before me. So feel free to rewind back and check that out after this talk if you want. But due to time, probably not going to get to it, but that's okay. They did a great job. So with that, let's go into a quick demo and I'll give you the grand tour of the dashboard. Cool. So I am currently using VS. I have currently got the eShop app running. This is an open repo that you can take advantage of. It's just called eShop. I was expecting it to pop up more throughout the stream, but I actually haven't seen it yet in the times I've popped in. So cool, welcome. It's a really good, old, reliable app that is great for demoing things, such as the dashboard. So when you first run your Aspire application, hitting F5, you'll be greeted with this wonderful dashboard that is your one-stop shop for all things diagnostics, health monitoring, general observation, and other kinds of inspection that you'll want to do while you're developing your application. So it's a really great spot for that, and it provides you a lot of resources, many of which are powered by open telemetry, which we're going to talk about in some detail today. So let me start from the top. We've got our resources page, which gives you a list of all the different containers, projects, executables, Postgres data, and more that make up your application. And you can see really great info about them, such as your state of each resource, when they started, the source coming from, the endpoints, logs, which we'll talk about in a second, and details, specifically environmental variables, I think is the main thing to look at in details land. And you can also use this window to look at any errors that a particular resource is facing, but it's looking like eShop is doing pretty well. So no red circles here right now, but just know that that is an option for you. And of course, you can go to your application itself. In this case, eShop is located under Web App, and that'll take me to this pretty sleek shop. So in addition to resources, we've got a lot of other options, starting with the console logs page. And this is like all of those print statements that you see get sent to your output window if you were debugging in Visual Studio or VS Code. And you can break this down by resource. So you can see all of those print statements that probably look very familiar to you if you're in an IDE and all that. That said, if you want to have a more filterable or structured experience with this, you can take advantage of the structured logs page. And this is really great if you want to start to narrow things down. There's certain logs that you're interested in. So maybe you can view by a resource. You can also view by things like errors. So here's an error message here. So you can filter just by those and view that information. And of course, you can view additional details about each log entry that's happening here. Additionally to that come my two favorite pages of the dashboard bunch, in my opinion. So leading into traces, which you can access via your log entries if it's relevant, or just going to traces. And this is a list of all of the different activities that are spanning your processes. So lots of different work and actions that are happening, lots of HTTP requests when you're working with a web app, for instance, that you can take advantage of. And in addition to getting this tabular view that lets you see that information, like let's look at this get HTTP request here, you can also click view under details and get this really cool Gantt chart, timeline, whatever you want to call it, that gives lets you see the timeline of events that revolved around this particular HTTP request. So there's all of the different resources that make up this activity. You can see how long each action took, and you can see when they started and when they ended in the context of the wire hole. So this is a really nice way to be able to break down things such as performance, like are certain actions and behaviors taking longer than they should? Maybe it's a good idea to take a look at this. Or are the actions even happening at all? Or maybe they're happening too much. So all these things you can use the traces page and the dashboard to try and diagnose. And last but not least, we've got the metrics page, which lets you view lots of different stats basically about your resources. I like this page a lot for when you're trying to do some general health monitoring or when you're trying to examine some perf or reliability concerns. So you've got stuff such as like garbage collection, which is not a great example here because you can't see any data, but let's choose one that does have data, like active requests, etc. So you can go through a lot of different options here and take a look at them. And of course, you can also create your own metrics, which I will talk about in just a few minutes. So the dashboard, it's a really nice option for being able to observe, inspect, debug, diagnose anything that's going on with your app in design time at design time in real time. So as an example, there actually is an error that I have with this eShop app. And that's when I click on one of these items, I'm noticing it's being rendered on the page twice, which I mean, I like a helmet and safety is important, but not this much. So I can go to the traces page in this case and further examine that HTTP request where I clicked on the item and go to view. And here I'm noticing that I've got two of the same API call that is happening here, which is probably overkill. I think I only need this once. So based off of that, I can then go to Visual Studio. And I believe that rendering issue is probably happening under my main layout page. Yeah, and sure enough, I've got the body of that page being rendered twice by accident. So let's get rid of that. And hopefully with the PowerPot reload, that issue should now be addressed. Yeah, so it's gone. Pretty sweet. I know it seems like a simple issue, but we actually that was actually based off a real world issue that the Aspire team we had a couple weeks ago with the project template where a body was inserted twice in a spot where it wasn't supposed to be. So that is a great example of how you can use the dashboard to examine potential issues with your application. So now let's talk a little bit more about telemetry and what's happening behind the scenes here. How are we getting all this data at the end of the day? So back to slide land. Telemetry in question consists of three major components, or I think components is a bad word. Let's say elements. So we've got logs, like our console logs, our structured logs. We've got activity, which is like our traces and all the different spans of work happening across processes. And we've got our metrics, which are like our stats. So all of these pieces of telemetry data have to pass through something. In this case, we're using open telemetry, which acts as a standard for how all this data is getting processed, collected, and ultimately exported to a backend that will then create a holistic view of all that data for you, the end user, and hence how we get the dashboard. So usually what happens in this process is that the backend is going to be represented by an APM or an application process manager. Excuse me if I got that abbreviation wrong. But examples of this include things such as application insights for Azure, or you've also got other ones like Grafana, Splunk, Datadog, just to name a few. Actually, there is a talk right after mine that's all about application insights if you're interested in that in particular. So also when you're setting up this telemetry for your application, usually you also need to do a lot of instrumentation configuration on your end. And again, the great part about Aspire is that that work is done for you with the power of both Aspire and its components. So, for example, if you added a Redis component, it all that work is already set up for you. You're going to get all of that related distributed tracing without having to do that setup on your end. And we also need exporters, which are going to take in that data and then make sure it's in the proper format before it's being sent to the backend. So there's lots of different exporters, such as Azure's Monitor Exporter, but for by default in Aspire, we typically use the OTLP exporter. And of course, this brings us back to the dashboard. So our backend in this case is going to be the dashboard, but this isn't it. I think it's important to note that the dashboard is not the same as an APM. The main difference between the two is that there's no real storage involved. Whoops, there's no real storage involved within the dashboard. So the dashboard was designed more from a developer standpoint and being able to diagnose issues at design time, not while your app is in production. Although that is certainly available, it doesn't come equipped with all those extra analyses that something like Grafana might have. And the scenarios, of course, like you don't have to choose one or the other, but for those real time at design time needs, the dashboard is the way to go. So let's go back into Visual Studio and I'll show you more of what I'm talking about when I say that Aspire sets up a lot of this work for you. And we're going to just create a new project so that I can prove that I am not lying about this. And yeah, I know I called it Aspire App 6. Very creative name. I know. I'm running out of name ideas. So the main action with OpenTelemetry setup in Aspire comes from the extensions.cs file here under service defaults project. And actually, let me see if I can't zoom in here a little bit. Cool. All right, so there's two major methods to take a look at. The first is configure OpenTelemetry. This is what's doing a lot of that legwork that you don't have to worry about when you're working with an Aspire app. It's setting up metrics, it's setting up traces, it's making sure logging is all put together. And then you've also got the add OpenTelemetry exporters method, which is setting up that OTLP exporter in this case. Although we did add the code for you if you want to take advantage of the Azure Monitor OpenTelemetry experience. So if that's something you want to use, feel free to uncomment that. And now that we're here, even though this is the default, you might want to add your own metrics or your own additional telemetry. So let's take an example and go do that. So this is a basic starter application I've got. If you haven't seen it before, it's like seeing a Blazor web app where you've got your default Hello World page, and then you've got your counter page, and then you've got your weather page that's generating 5 forecasts. So we're going to add some telemetry related to the weather specifically by going to program.cs under API service. Cool. So in here, there's a couple steps that we're going to need to do, but specifically, I want to add a metric and a metric that will count the number of forecasts that have happened across the app's execution. I'm going to add a trace that's going to indicate when a new forecast has been created and also create a log that shows that same information. So we're going to do all three. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because we've only got a little less than 15 minutes and y'all don't want to see me spend 10 minutes failing to spell things correctly. So I'm going to copy and paste instead. So I will walk you through what's going on. First, we're going to add a couple lines of code up top here. And a couple things going on. The first 2 lines represent us defining a new meter. Specifically, we're defining a counter that we want to increment every time a new forecast gets made. So here we're defining the name of the metric that's going to show up under metrics in the dashboard called forecast.count, and also giving it a description here. And next, we're going to add an activity source, and this is the class that's going to enable us to actually create a trace or a span of activity. So here we're using the same name weather backend as we did up top with the meter, just to make sure everything is tying together. And now we're going to add a couple more lines of code. But before I do that, I do want to make sure we've got the ability to add additional logging info. So let's add a iLogger up here. And here, before I copy paste over this, I want to explain what's happening here. We've basically got a loop that, or an interval that is generating 5 forecasts at a time, all random data, no issues there. So we're going to keep that same functionality, except I'm going to convert it to a for loop so that I can add some additional telemetry related info. So let's go ahead and do that. So there's a couple of new things here. The first is the start activity method here. So this is based off of that activity source that we created up top. And this is what is going to create that custom trace that will be related to when we formulate a weather forecast. From there, we are still generating some forecast data. But also, as we do that, we're going to increase our counter. So now that a new forecast has been made, that's when we up it. And then lastly, under this for loop, we're going to add a tag to the activity span. So this is basically going to be some additional detail that we'll get when the span is logged that will say when the forecast was made and what the general summary of it is. And then finally, for console log purposes, we're going to add an additional log that says sending weather forecast along with some other forecast information that was just created. All right. So now that we've done that, we just need to hook it up to our configured telemetry, which we can do by going back to our extensions.cs page. And under metrics, we're going to do .add meter, and then using weather.backend. And then we're doing add source, which is also weather.backend. Thank you, Copilot. And hopefully, if I copied and pasted things correctly, this should give us some additional information. So obviously, this is a more basic example here, but the good news is there's a lot of documentation about open telemetry all up. So if you need to create more advanced telemetry, you can. All right, so we're back at the dashboard. And we're going to go to our generic Hello World app. Specifically, we're going to check out the weather here. And I'm going to refresh a couple times, see if I can't get the data to refresh. There we go. So now there should be a couple locations where we can see our new custom telemetry. First is under console logs. We can go to API service. And now you'll notice some new logged information here that we just set up, sending weather forecast with all that additional info. We can also go to structured logs and see that similar information, just in a tabular format. And then we can go to traces and take a look at the weather call that happened here when we moved over to the weather page. So if we look at that and timeline chart, graph, whatever you want to call it, here is that trace that we created called forecast activity. And if we take a look at the extra data, you'll notice that extra information that we specified. And then last but not least, we've got metrics. Going back to API services, we can scroll down past all of our defaults and hey, check this out. It's our brand new counter. So complete with definition and what it's all about. And you get a nice little graph of information. So from the time that this app has been running, we've had 10 weather forecasts we made. Although if you look at the table version, you can see that we started at 5 and we went up 5 more to 10. So that is an example of how to create your own metrics. It's pretty nice. The good news is, again, if you don't want to have to do any of that, you don't have to, because Aspire gives you plenty of default information in the telemetry space without you having to do any extra work on your part. So now that we talked about telemetry under the context of an Aspire app, let's talk about telemetry when you don't have an Aspire app, because you can still take advantage of the standalone dashboard despite not having one. So I'm going to X out of this. And there's a specific command that we're going to run. Again, I'm going to cheat a little bit and copy paste it in order to successfully run the standalone dashboard. And I'll walk you through what's going on here. Cool. So The way the standalone dashboard works is that it is being containerized. So we're going to do a Docker run command in order to access the container from that image. So we're calling it Aspire dashboard, and it's coming from the mcr.microsoft.com image listed right here. And then a couple other critical things. We've got a couple port mappings up top here. The first is establishing the dashboard port and mapping it to the host port. And then we've got what I think is the more important one in our case, the 4317 port being mapped to 18889. It's a lot of beats. But 4317 is specifically where the open telemetry is currently located. So that is the port where OpenTelemetry is going to be receiving all of that app data and then sending it to the dashboard. So we want to make sure that with our OpenTelemetry enabled application, even if it's not Aspire related, that ultimately we've got a port exporter. Ultimately, we have an exporter that's being taken to port 317. Otherwise, we're not going to get any data. So there's a couple other pieces of info going on here, and I've added a couple environmental variables, all of which are documented with all the different possibilities. So by default, if you were to start up the standalone dashboard as is without any of these -E environmental variable options, you'd have to log in using an access token which show up under your command line of choice or whatever it is that you're using usually. But if you're in a secure spot and maybe you think that's overkill for the moment, you can use an environmental variable like this, dotnet dashboard unsecured allow anonymous equals to true. That is a mouthful in order to bypass that. Other examples of environmental variables you can use in this context include the dashboard telemetry limits for the logs, the traces, and metrics. So I believe the default is 10,000 entries for each of those. Don't count me on that. It's pretty high, but it's a lot higher than 1,000. But for whatever reason, if you don't want that many, you can change your max log count to whatever you want to do as other examples. And of course, there's a giant list of other variables that you can take advantage of here too. So we can go ahead and run this command. Okay. And then I can go into Docker here and I can see the Aspire dashboard container that's listed here. I can, of course, see the image it came from under images here. And I can also access the dashboard from here too. So I'm going to click on the port. Notice I did not need to log in this case, which you might have seen before if you've ever used the standalone dashboard up to this point. And yeah, this is not very useful at the moment, and that's because there's no data. And that's because we actually need to start up an app to go with it. So going into Visual Studio, because I only have 4 minutes, I already set up one for us, but I'll let you know what things you need to make sure you do. So I am opening up a basic Blazor app. Again, has nothing to do with Aspire whatsoever, no app host, no Aspire, nothing. However, I did configure it to include some OpenTelemetry setups. So making sure that you have a call to configure OpenTelemetry under your program.cs file, for instance, and then having the same methods that we explored a little bit about when we were creating our custom telemetry earlier. So, and plus the add OpenTelemetry exporters, you need to make sure that you are actually adding those related OpenTelemetry packages if you don't already have them. So make sure you add the following package references here. And last but not least, this one is super important. I actually messed this one up when I started using the standalone dashboard. And that is making sure you go to either appsettings.json or your launch settings.json and adding, oh gosh, it's OTLP exporter. I'm blanking on the name, but that's, again, why no. I always mix up OTEL and OTLP. I don't know about y'all, but that's just me. But making sure that you have this specific line. So OTEL exporter, OTLP endpoint. So as I mentioned earlier, we need to be able to connect our app to the spot where OpenTelemetry is actually going to read in that data. Otherwise, we're not going to get anything in the dashboard. So that's not cool. So we need to set our local host, in this case, to 4317. And now that we've done that, we can run this app and hopefully we'll see some actual data populate that standalone experience. And you know what? It's just so they're on the same page. Let's go to access it here. Here we go. Cool. So you'll notice something I didn't mention right away when you have the standalone dashboard is that you don't get resources or console log pages uh, as is. That requires you to have an Aspire app. But the good news is you can still take advantage of all of this when it comes to the open telemetry related content, such as your traces, such as sometimes your structured logs, and of course your metrics, which won't appear until I actually do something probably on this. So let's see. Interesting. Well, metrics should appear there, but I might be experiencing a bug at the moment. But at the very least, we do have traces here, and you can see a lot of the same information that you'd be able to see with your Aspire app. Pretty cool. So with that, we are out of time. So to close us out, thank you so much for watching this session. Hopefully you learned a lot more about the dashboard than you ever thought you did. And if you haven't explored the dashboard or Aspire yet, highly encourage you to check it out and please share your feedback. A lot of what we are currently working on and what we have added to the Aspire experience doesn't happen without y'all. So make sure you're sharing your feedback, the good and the bad, and we'll all help each other make this experience even better. So thanks y'all and happy coding.
Leslie, that was incredible. Wait a second. Can you? Oh, thank you so much because we're getting some echo. So that is an issue. Say, oh no, we're going to speak, and then you know how it is, echoes, right? So I have a question from you. So how do you feel for? Imagine that I am a beginner, right? And I'm saying, oh, I want to produce just a nice demo project for myself. Because Aspire, requires you to know a dashboard, tracer, services. You feel that like this can be a pattern that a beginner can follow start to finish, like starting following in their first day web developing, or do you feel that's no more production?
I feel like I think that's the goal in a lot of ways. I think because we're still new, I think there's a bit of growing pains when it comes to making sure the Aspire experience is accessible for people who are brand new to web development. But personally, I feel like that is one of the end games that we should aspire to do. So I think one of the perks about Aspire is that a lot of that additional legwork that you'd normally have to do by yourself or figure out on your own when you're creating your own web app is done for you. So not having to worry about how all these different components connect together, not having to worry about how to manually add telemetry for all those additional health checks and monitoring things that you might want to do. It's all done for you. So I definitely feel like that's a great perk for somebody who's brand new to the world of web development, where ultimately you don't want to focus on that at the end of the day. You want to write some cool code that helps a lot of people and that it is actually enjoyable to do rather than having those frustrations of just making sure everything's connected the way that it should and having to feel overwhelmed by just how many different components there are.
Two things. First, I'm gonna to tell you one thing. Do you have effect sounds on your clicks? So everything had like a bubble. Was kind of funny when you're explaining that. Then pop, 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 pop. Just a small fun fact. And lastly, any final message for us at this incredible .NET Aspire Dev Day?
Yeah, I hope you've been enjoying the stream. If you haven't seen everything, please go back and check out my awesome colleagues' talks, which are fantastic. And if you haven't already, please go try out Aspire and also share your feedback. I think Aspire is open source. So like if you wanted to even get more involved beyond just saying what your thoughts are, that's totally cool. But honestly, saying your thoughts are just as important in my opinion, at making sure that we create something that people actually want to use. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leslie. That was incredible.